The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the musty courthouse like a death knell. Marcus Chen sat rigidly in the uncomfortable wooden chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as the auctioneer's voice cut through his thoughts like a rusty blade. Sold to Marcus Chen for $8,000, lot 247. The Blackwater Marsh property, 437 acres of wetland in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. A snicker erupted from behind him, followed by his brother Derek's distinctly nasal voice. $8,000 for a swamp? Jesus, Marcus, Dad really did a number on your brain with all that environmental nonsense he filled your head with. Marcus turned to see his two younger brothers, Derek and Ryan, sharing a look of barely contained amusement. Derek, impeccably dressed in his tailored suit despite the humid Louisiana morning, shook his head with the kind of condescending smile that had irritated Marcus since childhood. Ryan, softer around the edges but no less smug, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled out his phone. "I'm telling Mom you just threw away your inheritance on a mosquito breeding ground," Ryan said, his fingers already dancing across the screen. "She's going to have a field day with this." Marcus stood slowly, feeling every one of his 43 years in his aching joints. The past 6 months since their father's death had been a marathon of legal proceedings, family arguments, and painful memories. Thomas Chen had been a geologist and environmental scientist who'd spent most of his life studying Louisiana's unique ecosystem, much to his younger son's embarrassment and his eldest son's fascination. "Dad wanted that land preserved," Marcus said quietly, folding the deed with careful precision. "It's been in our family for 3 generations. "Yeah, and look where it got us," Derek laughed. "Grandpa bought worthless swampland during the Depression. Dad spent his whole life pretending it was some kind of ecological treasure. And now you're carrying on the family tradition of making terrible financial decisions." The courthouse lobby felt suffocating despite the ancient air conditioning unit that wheezed and rattled in the corner. Other bidders filtered past them, some shooting curious glances at the 3 brothers who couldn't seem to lower their voices. Marcus tucked the deed into his jacket pocket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Ryan called after him. "To see what I bought." Derek's laughter followed him out into the parking lot. "Don't get eaten by an alligator, brother. We'd hate to lose you after you just made yourself poor." Marcus climbed into his dusty Ford pickup, the same truck he'd been driving for 8 years, and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, he could see Derek and Ryan emerging from the courthouse, still talking animatedly, probably already planning how they'd spend their portions of the estate, the sensible portions, as Derek had repeatedly called them. The downtown properties, the modest stock portfolio, the safe investments their father had accumulated over decades of careful living. But the swampland had been different. In his will, Thomas Chen had been explicit. The Blackwater Marsh was to be offered to his sons as a single lot, and whoever claimed it would be responsible for its preservation. Marcus had expected his brothers to at least consider it, perhaps see some potential for development or hunting leases. Instead, they'd both declined immediately, leaving Marcus to bid against a handful of developers and land speculators. $8,000 for 437 acres of Louisiana wetland that his grandfather had purchased for next to 1934, that his father had cherished. Marcus turned the key and felt the familiar rumble of the V8 engine. He'd grown up hearing stories about the Blackwater Marsh, about the unique species of birds that nested there, the ancient cypress trees that had weathered countless storms, the delicate balance of fresh and salt water that created one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the Gulf region. His father had taken him there dozens of times as a child, teaching him to identify animal tracks in the mud, to recognize the calls of different birds, to appreciate the subtle beauty of a landscape. that most people dismissed as useless wilderness. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Mom says you're an idiot. Family dinner Sunday. Try not to catch malaria before then." Marcus deleted the message and pulled out of the parking lot, heading southeast toward the parish boundaries where the Blackwater Marsh waited for him like an old friend he hadn't seen. In 20 years, we're about to dive deeper into Marcus's incredible journey, and what happens next will change everything. If you're already captivated by this story, please like this video and share it with someone who appreciates epic storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing narratives like this one. Now let's see how Marcus's fight for his father's legacy unfolds. The drive to Blackwater Marsh took Marcus through landscapes that shifted like pages in a photo album of Louisiana's geographic diversity. The suburban sprawl of the parish seat gave way to rural farmland, then to fishing villages where weathered boats bobbed at private docks, and finally to the kind of wild, untamed country that existed in the spaces between civilization's outposts. Marcus had made this drive many times as a child, usually sitting in the passenger seat of his father's old Bronco, while Derek and Ryan complained from the back about the smell of mud and fish, about the mosquitoes, about how boring it was to look at. Birds and trees when they could be home playing video games or watching television. Even then, the divide had been clear. Marcus inherited his father's fascination with the natural world, while his younger brothers inherited their mother's practical disdain for anything that didn't generate immediate, tangible value. The paved road ended at a rusted gate that Marcus remembered well. His father had installed it in the 1980s after repeated problems with illegal dumping and unauthorized hunting. The lock was new, probably installed by the estate lawyers, but Marcus had the key. Beyond the gate, a gravel road wound through increasingly dense vegetation toward the heart of the marsh. Marcus parked beside a weathered sign that read, "Private property, Blackwater Marsh Nature Preserve, no hunting, no fishing, no camping, violators will be prosecuted." His father had painted that sign himself, using stencils and white paint that had faded to a pale gray over the years. Below the main text in smaller letters was a line that Marcus had helped paint when he was 12. Established by Thomas Chen, 1987. The silence hit him first. After the constant hum of traffic and air conditioning, the marsh offered something Marcus had almost forgotten: genuine quiet, broken only by the rustle of wind through grass and the distant splash of something large moving through water. He grabbed his backpack from the truck bed, checking to make sure he had water, insect repellent, his camera, and the handheld GPS unit he'd bought for the occasion. The trail into the marsh was overgrown, but still passable. Marcus found himself falling into the rhythm his father had taught him decades earlier. Step carefully, watch for snakes, move slowly enough to see rather than simply pass through. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing a landscape that seemed frozen in time. Ancient cypress trees rose from the water like cathedral columns. Their massive trunks flared at the base, their canopy creating a green ceiling that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the water's surface. Spanish moss draped from the branches like tattered curtains, and everywhere Marcus looked, he saw signs of life: bird nests tucked into protected alcoves, fish jumping in the distance, the V-shaped wake of something swimming just below the surface. His phone had no signal here, which felt like a blessing rather than an inconvenience. For the first time in months, Marcus couldn't receive messages from Derek about his poor decision-making, or calls from Ryan about estate paperwork, or emails from his ex-wife's lawyer about overdue alimony payments. The marsh existed outside, the network of obligations and criticisms that had dominated his life since his father's death. Marcus reached the old observation platform his father had built in the early 1990s. The wooden structure was weathered but solid, elevated about 10 feet above the water level and offering a panoramic view of the marsh's interior. From this vantage point, Marcus could see for miles across a landscape that looked much as it had when his grandfather first purchased it. He climbed the platform and sat on the bench his father had installed, pulling out the folder of documents he'd brought with him. The deed, obviously, but also copies of his grandfather's original purchase agreement, his father's research notes, and aerial photographs spanning 7 decades. The changes were subtle but significant. The shoreline had shifted slightly. Some channels had filled in while others had deepened, and the vegetation patterns had evolved in response to storms and changing water levels. But the basic character of the place remained unchanged. This was still the Blackwater Marsh that had fascinated 3 generations of Chen men, even if only one of them had been alive to appreciate it at any given time. Marcus opened his father's research journal, a leather-bound notebook filled with decades of observations written in Thomas Chen's precise handwriting. The entries dated back to 1979, when Marcus was just 7 years old, and continued through the previous autumn. Reading them was like having a conversation with his father across the boundary of death. March 15, 1983. Observed nesting pair of wood ducks in hollow cypress their eastern boundary. Marcus identified male's distinctive markings without assistance. His enthusiasm for field work continues to develop. September 22, 1995. Hurricane Katrina damage assessment. Lost approximately 30% of mature cypress in southern section, but regeneration already beginning. Noted increased bird activity in newly opened areas. Marcus, age 23, assisted with damage survey during Thanksgiving visit. Derek and Ryan remained in town. June 8, 2018. Concerning changes in water chemistry noted during summer sampling. pH levels declining, possibly due to agricultural runoff from upstream developments. Need to investigate pollution sources. Boys think I'm paranoid about environmental threats, but data doesn't lie. That last entry stung. Marcus remembered the conversation his father was referencing, a family dinner where Thomas had tried to explain his concerns about water quality, only to be dismissed by Derek as an environmental extremist and by Ryan as someone who saw problems where none existed. Marcus had remained silent during that argument, caught between his father's passion and his brother's skepticism. Now, sitting alone in the place his father had loved most, Marcus felt the weight of that silence. How many times had he failed to support his father's work, choosing diplomatic neutrality over taking sides? How many opportunities had he missed to learn more about this place while Thomas was still alive to teach him? The guilt was interrupted by movement in the water below. A great blue heron emerged from the reeds with the kind of fluid grace that made Marcus reach for his camera. The bird stepped delicately through the shallows, its neck coiled like a spring, its eyes scanning for prey with predatory intensity. Marcus managed several shots before the heron noticed him and took flight, its massive wings carrying it deeper into the marsh with slow, powerful strokes. His father would have been thrilled by the sighting. Thomas had kept detailed records of bird populations in the marsh, noting seasonal migrations, breeding patterns, and behavioral changes over the decades. According to his research, great blue herons had been declining in the area due to habitat loss and water pollution, making each sighting increasingly precious. Marcus spent the rest of the morning exploring the trail system his father had maintained. Over the years, some paths were barely passable after months of neglect, but others remained clear enough for easy walking. At each major landmark, the beaver dam near the North Channel, the stand of ancient live oaks on the eastern ridge, freshwater spring that bubbled up from underground limestone, Marcus found evidence of his father's stewardship. Trail markers, observation blinds, water quality monitoring stations, even a few rustic benches positioned to take advantage of particularly scenic views. It was a labor of love spanning 4 decades, a testament to one man's dedication to preserving a piece of Louisiana's natural heritage. And Derek and Ryan had dismissed it all as worthless SWAMPL, Marcus reached the property's southern boundary around noon, where the marsh gave way to agricultural fields owned by a corporate farming operation. The contrast was stark. On one side, the wild diversity of the wetland ecosystem. On the other, row after row of soybeans stretching to the horizon like green corduroy. A drainage canal separated the two properties, its concrete sides channeling runoff from the farmland toward the Gulf of Mexico. This was where his father's water quality concerns had been focused. Marcus found monitoring equipment still in place: pH meters, water samplers, and data loggers that Thomas had used to track changes in the marsh's chemistry. The readings were concerning. Acidity levels that should have been stable were fluctuating wildly, and nutrient loads suggested fertilizer contamination from the adjacent farmland. Marcus made notes in his father's journal, continuing the research tradition even though he lacked Thomas's scientific training. He collected water samples and GPS coordinates, planning to have them analyzed by the environmental consulting firm where he worked as a project manager. It was the least he could do to honor his father's memory and understand the challenges facing the property he'd just inherited. The afternoon brought visitors. Marcus was photographing a family of river otters when he heard voices approaching through the marsh. He looked up to see 3 people in waders making their way along the main trail. 2 men and a woman, all carrying expensive-looking cameras and field equipment. "Excuse me," called the woman, an athletic-looking blonde in her 30s who moved through the marsh with obvious experience. "Are you the new owner?" Marcus nodded, climbing down from his observation post. "Marcus Chen, and you are?" "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, LSU Environmental Sciences," she said, extending a muddy hand. "These are my graduate students, Jake and Tomas. We've been conducting research here for the past 3 years with your father's permission. We heard about the estate sale and wanted to introduce ourselves." The relief Marcus felt was immediate and overwhelming. Here were people who understood the value of what he'd inherited, who saw the marsh as something more than worthless swampland. "Dad never mentioned ongoing research," Marcus said. "What kind of work are you doing?" Jake, a tall redhead with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Marcus of his younger self, answered first. "Biodiversity surveys, mainly. Dr. Chen, your father, gave us access to his 40 years of data, and we've been building on it with modern techniques. The Blackwater Marsh is incredibly unique. We've identified 3 plant species that exist nowhere else in Louisiana," Tomas added quietly, "and possibly 2 that are completely new to science." Marcus studied the tablet, seeing his property through the lens of scientific analysis for the first time. The data revealed patterns invisible to casual observation: wildlife corridors, seasonal flooding cycles, and ecological relationships that had taken millions of years to develop. "The thing is," Dr. Mitchell continued, "we're at a critical point in the research. We have funding for another 2 years, but we need continued access to complete the studies. Some of our monitoring equipment is permanently installed, and we have experimental plots that can't be moved." "Of course," Marcus said immediately. Dad would have wanted the work to continue. The relief on their faces was obvious. "We weren't sure what to expect," Jake admitted. The estate lawyers mentioned there were other heirs who might have different priorities. Marcus thought about Derek's dismissive laughter and Ryan's condescending texts. "My brothers aren't particularly interested in environmental research." "But you are?" Dr. Mitchell asked. Marcus looked around at the marsh, at the centuries-old trees and the clear water, and the subtle signs of life everywhere he turned. "I'm starting to be." They spent the next 2 hours walking the property together, with the researchers pointing out details Marcus would never have noticed on his own. The way certain trees grew in patterns that indicated underground water flow, the relationship between bird nesting sites and tidal cycles, the signs of climate change stress that were beginning to affect even this protected ecosystem. "Your father was documenting changes that most people wouldn't notice for decades," Dr. Mitchell explained. Rising sea levels, shifting precipitation, patterns, temperature fluctuations. They're all having subtle but measurable impacts on the marsh's ecology. Is that why he was concerned about water quality? Marcus asked, partly. But the agricultural runoff is a more immediate threat. The farm operation upstream has been expanding its use of chemical fertilizers, and we're seeing the effects downstream. Algal blooms, fish kills, changes in plant communities. Your father was trying to document the contamination for a potential lawsuit. That evening, Marcus sat on the observation platform as the sun set over the marsh, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the still water like molten metal. The day had transformed his understanding of what he'd inherited. This wasn't just 400 acres of wetland, it was a living laboratory, a repository of biodiversity, a piece of Louisiana's natural heritage that existed nowhere else in Comfey. The world. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. How's your swamp? Find any oil wells yet? LOL. Marcus deleted the message without responding. He had found something far more valuable than oil, something his brothers would never understand or appreciate. He had found his father's true legacy and his own purpose. The sound of his truck starting up echoed across the marsh as Marcus began the drive home, his mind already racing with plans. He needed to learn more about environmental law, about conservation, easements, about the scientific work being conducted on his property. He needed to understand the threats facing the marsh and the legal options for addressing them. Most importantly, he needed to prove that his father's faith in him hadn't been misplaced. Thomas Chen had trusted his eldest son to protect the Blackwater marsh, and Marcus was determined not to let him down, even if it meant fighting his own family to do it. The family dinner Sunday was exactly as uncomfortable as Marcus had expected. His mother's house in suburban Meteorite felt claustrophobic after a day in the open spaces of the marsh, all polished surfaces and climate-controlled air that smelled of cleaning products rather than earth and water. Derek and Ryan were already there when Marcus arrived, ensconced in the living room with drinks and the kind of satisfied expressions that suggested they'd been discussing his mistake for some time. Their mother, Helen Chun, emerged from the kitchen with the forced smile she wore when she was preparing to deliver unwelcome truths. Marcus, honey, sit down. We need to talk. The intervention had been planned in advance, obviously. Derek had printed out real estate listings for comparable properties in the area, all of them priced significantly higher than the $8,000 Marcus had paid. Ryan had prepared a spreadsheet showing potential returns on different investment strategies. Their mother had compiled a list of practical expenses Marcus hadn't considered: property taxes, maintenance costs, liability insurance. You're 42 years old, Helen said, her voice carrying the weight of maternal disappointment. You can't afford to make decisions based on sentiment. Your father filled your head with all sorts of romantic notions about that swamp. But romance doesn't pay the bills. Marcus sat quietly through 20 minutes of financial analysis and family psychology, letting his brothers and mother exhaust their arguments before responding. When they finally ran out of steam, he pulled out his own folder of documents. I met with LSU researchers yesterday, he said. The property is part of an ongoing biodiversity study. They've identified multiple species that exist nowhere else in Louisiana. Derek rolled his eyes. Great, you own bugs that nobody else has. How much money does that make you? It makes me eligible for federal conservation grants, Marcus replied. Habitat preservation funding, research partnerships, tax incentives for maintaining ecological integrity. The Nature Conservancy has an entire program for privately owned wetlands. Ryan adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. How much money are we talking about? I don't know yet. But I know the research has potential commercial applications. New species often lead to pharmaceutical discoveries, agricultural innovations, environmental remediation techniques. Louisiana wants to establish a permanent research station on the property. It wasn't entirely true. Dr. Mitchell had mentioned the possibility of a research station, but nothing was confirmed. Marcus was stretching the facts to match his family's language of profit and loss, translating his father's environmental passion into terms they might understand. Helen looked skeptical. That sounds very speculative, Marcus. What if these researchers are wrong? What if there's nothing valuable there? Then I own 400 acres of pristine wetland in a state where development pressure is destroying natural habitat every day, Marcus said. Land values for conservation properties are increasing faster than any other real estate sector. This was actually true, something he'd learned during his afternoon of frantic internet research. The growing awareness of climate change and environmental degradation was driving demand for preserved natural areas, both as investments and as carbon offset opportunities for corporations looking to improve their environmental profiles. Derek wasn't convinced. You're gambling your inheritance on maybes and possibilities. Ryan and I took the smart money municipal bonds, blue chip stocks, rental properties, safe investments that generate reliable income. And in 20 years you'll have modest returns. On modest investments, Marcus said. While I'll own a piece of Louisiana that can't be replaced, can't be replicated, and gets more valuable every year as wilderness becomes scarce. The argument continued through dinner, with Marcus defending his decision against increasingly personal attacks on his judgment, his financial acumen, and his failure to learn from his father's mistakes. Derek was particularly harsh, suggesting that Marcus was repeating Thomas's pattern of prioritizing idealistic fantasies over practical responsibilities. Dad spent 40 years playing scientist in that swamp while Mom worked 2 jobs to support the family, Derek said. He could have developed that land, sold it to developers, invested the money intelligently. Instead, he left us with the mess of an estate sale and you with 400 acres of mosquitoes. He left me with something irreplaceable, Marcus replied. Something that has scientific value, ecological importance, and increasing economic potential. You and Ryan can keep your safe investments. I'll take the chance on something that matters. The evening ended with hurt feelings and unresolved tensions, as Marcus had known it would. His family had made their positions clear. They saw his inheritance as a mistake, his decision as foolish, and his plans as unrealistic. They expected him to fail, and perhaps secretly hoped he would, if only to prove their own choices superior. Marcus drove home to his small apartment, feeling more isolated than ever, but also more determined. His father had faced similar skepticism and criticism throughout his life, had persisted in his research and conservation efforts despite his family's lack of support. If Thomas Chen could spend 40 years protecting the Blackwater Marsh against indifference and hostility, Marcus could certainly manage to carry on that work for whatever time remained. His phone rang as he was getting ready for bed. Dr. Mitchell's name appeared on the screen. I hope I'm not calling too late, she said. I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Not at all. I was just thinking about the research station idea. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I've been discussing your property with colleagues in the department, and there's significant interest in establishing a long-term research presence. The biodiversity data we're collecting could support multiple graduate dissertations, and the conservation implications are substantial. Marcus felt a surge of vindication. What would that involve? Funding, primarily. Research grants that would cover equipment, student stipends, and a modest payment to you for property access. Nothing dramatic, but enough to offset your maintenance costs and property taxes. More importantly, it would establish legal protections for the marsh's ecological integrity. Legal protections? Research designations carry regulatory weight. If the property is part of ongoing scientific studies, it becomes much more difficult for outside parties to impact the ecosystem. Agricultural pollution, development pressure, industrial activities, they all have to be evaluated against the Research value. Marcus thought about the fertilizer runoff his father had been documenting, about the corporate farm operation whose practices were already affecting water quality in the marsh. Would that apply to contamination from adjacent properties? Absolutely. In fact, that's something we need to discuss. Our latest water samples show concerning trends. The contamination levels are approaching thresholds that could trigger federal environmental protections. Marcus felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. His father's water quality monitoring hadn't been paranoid environmentalism. It had been methodical documentation of a genuine threat. The research station wouldn't just protect the marsh's scientific value. It would provide legal standing to address the contamination problems that were endangering the ecosystem. "I'm interested," Marcus said. "Very interested." "Excellent. I'll prepare a formal proposal for the university administration. With your father's 40 years of baseline data and our current research, we should be able to make a compelling case for permanent funding." After Dr. Mitchell hung up, Marcus sat in his darkened apartment, feeling something he hadn't experienced since his father's death. Hope. Not just for the financial viability of his inheritance, but for the possibility of meaningful work, of contributing to something larger than himself, of honoring Thomas Chun's memory in a way that would have made the old man proud. Derek and Ryan might never understand, but they didn't have to. The Blackwater Marsh would speak for itself in the language of scientific discovery and ecological preservation that transcended family politics and financial skepticism. Marcus was beginning to realize that he hadn't just inherited 400 acres of wetland. He had inherited a mission, a purpose, and a chance to prove that some things were worth more than money, even if he had to fight his entire family to protect them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to Marcus's apartment. The return address showed Hartwell and Associates Environmental Consulting, and the contents were both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus had submitted water samples from the marsh to 3 different laboratories, using money he couldn't really afford to spend, hoping to understand the contamination his father had been tracking. The results were worse than he had feared and better than he had dared hope. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell's analysis was thorough and damning. The Blackwater Marsh was experiencing systematic pollution from agricultural runoff with chemical signatures that matched fertilizers and pesticides used in large-scale farming operations. Nitrogen and phosphorus levels were approaching critical thresholds. Heavy metal concentrations suggested illegal dumping, and pH fluctuations indicated ongoing contamination from multiple sources. But the report also contained language that made Marcus's heart race. The contamination patterns documented in these samples, combined with the extensive baseline data provided by the property owner, constitute clear evidence of environmental violations that fall under Federal Clean Water Act protections. The unique ecological significance of the affected wetland strengthens the case for immediate regulatory intervention. Marcus read the report 3 times, then called Dr. Mitchell. "This is exactly what we needed," she said after reviewing the key findings. "Combined with your father's historical data, we have documentation spanning decades. The university's legal department will be very interested in this." What does that mean practically? It means we can file complaints with the EPA and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. It means we have standing to demand that the contaminating parties clean up their act or face federal penalties. It means your property becomes legally protected as an impacted ecosystem. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and dread. It also means I'm about to make some very powerful enemies. The farm operation upstream is owned by Consolidated Agricultural Services, Dr. Mitchell said grimly. They're a billion-dollar corporation with operations across the Gulf Coast. They don't like being told what to do with their land use practices. That afternoon, Marcus drove out to the marsh to collect additional samples and photograph evidence of contamination. He found more than he had expected. dead fish floating in one of the side channels, unusual algae growth near the agricultural boundary, and an oily sheen on the water that hadn't been there during his previous visits. He was documenting the fish kill with his camera when he heard vehicles approaching. 2 pickup trucks emerged from the tree line, both bearing the Consolidated Agricultural Services logo. 4 men climbed out, all of them wearing company uniforms and expressions that suggested this wasn't a social visit. The man who approached Marcus was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with problems through intimidation. His name tag read Bill Sutherland, site manager. "You must be the new owner," Sutherland said, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm Bill Sutherland. I manage the farming operation upstream." "Thought I should introduce myself." Marcus nodded cautiously. "Marcus Chen, nice to meet you. I heard you've been taking water samples, asking questions about chemical runoff." "You're right, of course, but I wanted to make sure you understand the situation." "What situation is that?" Sutherland gestured toward the agricultural fields visible in the distance. "We've been farming this area for 20 years. Good neighbors, good environmental stewards, full compliance with all state and federal regulations. Your father understood that. Never had any problems with him." The implication was clear. Thomas Chun had been cooperative, and Marcus would be wise to follow his example. But Marcus remembered his father's research notes, the years of careful documentation that had led to increasingly urgent concerns about water quality degradation. "My father was documenting contamination from your operation," Marcus said quietly. "His research shows systematic pollution dating back over a decade." The other 3 men moved closer, not obviously threatening, but making their presence felt. Sutherland's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Your father was a nice old man who liked birds and trees. Sometimes nice old men see problems that don't exist, especially when they get older and start forgetting things." The condescension in Sutherland's voice sparked anger in Marcus's chest. He wasn't forgetting anything. His data is scientifically rigorous and his conclusions are supported by independent laboratory analysis. "Is that so?" Sutherland pulled out his phone and made a show of taking Marcus's picture. "Well, Mr. Chun, I appreciate you being straightforward about your intentions. That'll make this easier for everyone. Make what easier?" "Understanding each other's positions. You see, Consolidated Agricultural Services has significant investments in this region. We employ dozens of local people. We contribute to the tax base. We're part of the economic foundation that keeps this parish running. That gives us certain considerations with local authorities." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sutherland was making it clear that his company had influence, resources, and the ability to make Marcus's life difficult if he chose to pursue environmental complaints. "On the other hand," Sutherland continued, "you're new to property ownership, new to environmental issues, new to understanding how things work in rural Louisiana. It would be easy for someone in your position to make mistakes, get in over their head, find themselves facing problems they're not equipped to handle." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. "Are you threatening me?" "Just sharing information, helping you understand the situation before you make decisions you might regret." Sutherland smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're reasonable people, Mr. Chun. We don't want conflicts with neighbors. But we also don't appreciate outsiders making accusations that could damage our reputation or interfere with our operations." "Outsiders? You live in the city, work for an environmental consulting firm, bought this property at an estate sale. That makes you an outsider as far as local folks are concerned. People here have long memories, and they remember who supports the local economy and who creates problems for it." Marcus looked around at the marsh, at the dead fish floating in the contaminated water, at the oily sheen that reflected rainbow colors in the afternoon sunlight. He thought about his father's decades of research, About Dr. Mitchell's biodiversity studies, about the unique ecosystem that was being slowly poisoned by industrial agriculture. I understand your position, Marcus said carefully. But I also understand mine. This is my property, and I have legal rights to protect it from contamination. Sutherland nodded. Legal rights, sure. But legal rights can be expensive to enforce, especially when you're going up against people with resources and community support. Courts favor local interests, Mr. Chen. Always have. The men climbed back into their trucks and drove away, leaving Marcus alone with the dead fish and the growing realization that he had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple environmental dispute. Consolidated Agricultural Services wasn't just a farming operation. It was a political and economic force that viewed his property as a potential threat to its operations. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon collecting evidence and thinking about Sutherland's words. The man had been clear about the power dynamics involved: $1 billion corporation with local connections and political influence versus a single property owner with limited resources and no community support. But Marcus also thought about his father's research about the unique species Dr. Mitchell's team was documenting, about the irreplaceable ecosystem that was being systematically destroyed by chemical contamination. Some fights were worth having, even when the odds were stacked against you. His phone rang as he was driving home. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Chen? This is Janet Broussard with the Vermilion Parish Assessor's Office. I'm calling about your recent property acquisition. Marcus pulled over to take the call. What about it? Well, sir, there seems to be some confusion about the property's tax assessment. We've received information suggesting that the land might be more valuable than the current assessment indicates. What kind of information? Commercial development potential, primarily. Apparently there are parties interested in the property's mineral rights, drainage possibilities, agricultural conversion potential. The assessment might need to be revised upward significantly. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. The property is wetland. It's protected by federal regulations and environmental designations. Yes, sir, we understand that. But assessments are based on highest and best use potential, not current restrictions. Environmental regulations can change, and private property rights generally prevail in assessment determinations. The conversation continued for 10 minutes, with Broussard explaining how property tax assessments could be challenged and revised, how commercial interest in land typically drove valuations higher, and how Marcus might be facing tax bills substantially larger than he had anticipated. When Marcus hung up, he sat in his truck for a long time, watching the sun set over the agricultural fields in the distance. The message was becoming clear. Consolidated Agricultural Services wasn't just threatening him directly. They were using their local connections to create financial pressure that would make his ownership of the marsh economically unsustainable. The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. Marcus arrived at his office at Environmental Solutions, Inc. to find his supervisor, Dave Kellner, waiting with the kind of expression that preceded difficult conversations. Marcus, we need to talk, Dave said, closing the office door behind them. I got a call yesterday from someone asking questions about you. What kind of questions? Professional questions. Your qualifications, your employment history, your reliability as a project manager. The caller said they were conducting due diligence for a potential business relationship. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Who was calling? Someone from Hartwell and Associates. Said they were considering you for a consulting contract and wanted references. Dave paused, studying Marcus's face. The thing is, Marcus, Hartwell and Associates is one of our competitors. They don't usually call us for references on our employees. The implication was clear. Someone had been asking about Marcus's professional background, possibly looking for leverage to use against him. The timing, coming immediately after his confrontation with Sutherland, was too convenient to be coincidental. There's something else, Dave continued. I got another call this morning from Consolidated Agricultural Services. They're interested in hiring us for environmental impact assessments on some expansion projects in Vermilion Parish. Big contract. Potentially very lucrative. Marcus saw where this was heading, and they asked about me specifically. They did. Wanted to know if you were involved in any projects that might create conflicts of interest. I told them you own property in the area, but that it wouldn't affect your professional objectivity. Dave, the thing is, Marcus, if CS becomes a major client, we can't have employees working on projects that put them in adversarial relationships with the company. It's a conflict of interest that could cost us the contract. Marcus stared at his supervisor, a man he'd worked with for 6 years, someone he'd considered both a mentor and a friend. Are you asking me to drop the environmental complaints against CAS? I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture. Your personal property dispute affects the entire company. We have 12 employees, Marcus. Families depending on the income this place generates. I can't let one person's private agenda jeopardize everyone's livelihood. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Dave explaining the economic realities of running a small environmental consulting firm. In Louisiana, major corporate clients were rare and valuable, and Consolidated Agricultural Services represented the kind of steady, high-paying work that could secure the company's future for years. Marcus understood the position his supervisor was in, but he also understood the position he was in. Dropping his environmental complaints would mean abandoning his father's research, betraying Dr. Mitchell's scientific work, and allowing the systematic destruction of a unique ecosystem to continue. Unchecked. I need time to think about this, Marcus said finally. Don't take too long, Dave replied. CAS wants an answer about the consulting contract by the end of the week. Marcus spent his lunch hour walking around downtown, trying to clear his head and understand the scope of the forces aligned against him. Consolidated Agricultural Services wasn't just a farming operation. It was a corporate entity with the resources and connections to pressure him through multiple channels simultaneously. His property taxes, his employment, his professional reputation. Even his family relationships were all potential targets. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Heard you're having problems with the swamp already. Maybe it's time to cut your losses and sell to someone who knows what they're doing. Marcus stared at the message, wondering how Derek had learned about his recent difficulties. Had someone from CAS contacted his family? Were his brothers part of the pressure campaign, or simply opportunistic observers looking to capitalize on his troubles? He was still contemplating the implications when Dr. Mitchell called. Marcus, I have news. Good news, and potentially concerning. News. I could use some good news. The university approved our research station proposal. We'll have funding for at least 3 years. Possibly 5 if the initial results are strong. Your property is now officially designated as a research site under LSU's Environmental Sciences program. Marcus felt a surge of relief. That's fantastic. What's the concerning news? I've been hearing rumors about pressure being applied to property owners in the area. Apparently someone's been asking questions about research activities, trying to determine if there are ways to challenge the scientific validity of our work. What kind of challenges? Methodology questions, funding source inquiries, attempts to discredit the research before it can be used in regulatory proceedings. It's a common corporate strategy when they're facing environmental complaints. Marcus thought about the call Dave had received from Hartwell and Associates about the sudden interest from CAS in hiring his company. They're trying to neutralize the research by undermining the researchers. Exactly. Which is why I wanted to give you a heads up about something else. We're not the only research team working in your area. What do you mean? I've been networking with colleagues at other universities, sharing our preliminary findings, trying to build broader scientific support for the ecosystem's protection. It turns out There are multiple research interests converging on the Blackwater Marsh. Dr. Mitchell explained that the unique geological features of the marsh had attracted attention from researchers in fields beyond environmental science. Geologists were interested in the underground limestone formations that created the freshwater springs. Archaeologists had identified evidence of prehistoric human settlements along the higher ridges. Even astronomers had expressed interest in the area's geological history. Astronomers? Marcus asked. Apparently, the soil composition and topographical features suggest possible meteor impact sites. Very ancient, probably millions of years old, but potentially significant for understanding impact geology in the Gulf region. Marcus felt a strange flutter of excitement. Meteor impact sites? It's speculative at this point. But if confirmed, it would add another layer of scientific protection for the property. Impact sites are rare and geologically significant. They often receive federal protection, regardless of private property rights. That evening, Marcus drove out to the marsh. With new eyes, he walked the familiar trails, but now he was looking for evidence of ancient cosmic violence, circular depressions, unusual rock formations, soil characteristics that might indicate extraterrestrial origins. He found Dr. Mitchell at the research station she'd established near the freshwater spring, surrounded by monitoring equipment and sample containers. With her were two people Marcus hadn't met, a tall, bearded man in his 50s and a younger woman with short dark hair and intense brown eyes. Marcus, perfect timing, Dr. Mitchell said. I'd like you to meet Dr. James Crawford from LSU Geology and Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Museum of Natural Science. They're here to evaluate the meteor impact hypothesis. Dr. Crawford had the weathered appearance of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, his hands stained with soil and his boots caked with mud. Your property sits on a very interesting geological formation, he said without preamble. The limestone springs, the circular topography, the mineral composition, it all suggests impact origin. Dr. Vasquez was more cautious. We need extensive sampling and analysis before drawing conclusions. But the preliminary indicators are intriguing. They spent the next 2 hours walking the property, with the geologist pointing out features Marcus had never noticed. The way the land formed subtle ridges radiating outward from the central spring. The presence of shocked quartz crystals in certain soil samples. The unusual magnetic properties of rocks found near the property's center. If this is confirmed as an impact site, Dr. Crawford explained, it would be one of the oldest documented craters in North America. The geological significance would be immense. What would that mean legally? Marcus asked. Federal protection, almost certainly, Dr. Vasquez replied. Impact sites fall under multiple jurisdictions: NASA, the National Science Foundation, the Department of the Interior. Once documented, they become nationally significant geological features. Marcus felt hope rising in his chest. If the Blackwater Marsh was confirmed as a meteor impact site, it would become untouchable by corporate interests or local political pressure. Consolidated Agricultural Services would have no choice but to modify their operations to prevent contamination of a nationally protected geological formation. But that hope was tempered by the realization that Dr. Crawford and Dr. Vasquez's presence wouldn't remain secret for long. If CAS had sources monitoring research activities in the area, they would soon learn about the geological investigation and its potential implications. Marcus was right to be concerned. The next morning, his phone rang before dawn. Mr. Chen, this is Sheriff Tony Boudreau, Vermilion Parish. I need you to come down to my office this morning. We've got some issues to discuss regarding your property. Marcus checked his alarm clock. 5:47 a.m. What kind of issues, Sheriff? Trespassing complaints, environmental violations, interference with agricultural operations. Someone's filed formal complaints that require investigation. Complaints from whom? I'd prefer to discuss this in person, Mr. Chen. Can you be here by 9? Marcus agreed, though his mind was racing with possibilities. Consolidated Agricultural Services was escalating their pressure campaign, using law enforcement to intimidate him and potentially create legal obstacles to his environmental research. He called Dr. Mitchell to warn her about the situation. "They're moving fast," she said grimly. "I'll contact the university's legal department and make sure our research activities are properly documented and authorized." "What about the geological investigation?" "Crawford and Vasquez are here on official university business with proper permits. If someone's trying to interfere with legitimate scientific research, they're going to face federal oversight." Marcus hung up feeling slightly better, but still apprehensive about his meeting with the sheriff. He had never been involved in legal disputes before, had never faced the kind of coordinated pressure campaign that CAS seemed capable of mounting. As he dressed for what felt like a confrontation rather than a conversation, Marcus thought about his father's decades of quiet persistence in protecting the marsh. Thomas Chen had faced skepticism and indifference, but probably not active hostility from billion-dollar corporations and local law enforcement. Marcus was discovering that inheriting his father's conservation mission meant inheriting all the enemies that came with it. The question was whether he had the courage and resources to fight battles his father had never had to face. He was about to find out. The Vermilion Parish Sheriff's Office occupied a modern building that felt more like a corporate headquarters than a traditional law enforcement facility. Marcus arrived at 8:50 and was immediately shown into Sheriff Boudreau's office, where he found himself facing not just the sheriff, but two other men in business suits. Sheriff Boudreau was a large man with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect without requiring explanation. The other two men introduced themselves as representatives of Consolidated Agricultural Services, their corporate attorney, and their regional operations manager. "Mr. Chen," Sheriff Boudreau began, "I appreciate you coming in. We've received several complaints about activities on your property that may be violating local ordinances and interfering with legitimate business operations." The CAS attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase full of documents, took over the conversation. "Mr. Chen, our client has been a responsible corporate citizen in this parish for over 20 years. Recently, however, activities associated with your property have begun to interfere with our operations and create potential liability issues." "What activities?" Marcus asked. "Unauthorized research activities, collection of proprietary agricultural data, interference with drainage systems, and most concerning, public accusations of environmental violations based on questionable scientific methods." Marcus felt his temper rising. "The research activities are authorized by LSU. The data collection is on my own property. And the environmental violations are documented by independent laboratory analysis." The operations manager, a man named Peterson, leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, your property's drainage naturally flows into our agricultural areas. Any contamination of our crops by materials introduced during your research activities creates liability for our operations and potentially for you personally." Marcus stared at him. "Are you seriously suggesting that my environmental research is contaminating your farm operation?" "I'm suggesting that untrained individuals conducting unsupervised scientific activities on property that connects to our water systems creates risks that we can't accept," Peterson replied smoothly. Sheriff Boudreau consulted a folder of documents. "Mr. Chen, I've got complaints here about trespassing on adjacent properties, interference with agricultural equipment, and collection of materials that may belong to neighboring landowners. I've never trespassed on anyone's property. I've never interfered with any equipment. And I've only collected samples from my own land." The CS attorney produced photographs from his briefcase. "These images show you on Consolidated Agricultural Services property, taking photographs and collecting materials without permission. Marcus examined the photos, which clearly showed him near the drainage canal that formed the boundary between his property and the corporate farm. I was on my own property. The boundary is clearly marked. The boundary is disputed, the attorney replied. Our surveys indicate that the drainage canal and associated infrastructure lie entirely within our property rights. Your activities in that area constitute trespassing. Marcus felt the conversation spiraling out of his control. CAS was rewriting the facts, creating a version of reality that painted him as the aggressor and them as the victim. They had photographs, legal documents, and the backing of local law enforcement. Sheriff, Marcus said, I'd like to see these survey documents that allegedly show boundary disputes. Sheriff Boudreau looked uncomfortable for the first time during the meeting. Mr. Chen, that's a civil matter between property owners. My concern is with the criminal complaints trespassing, interference with business operations, potential environmental violations. Environmental violations by me? Unauthorized introduction of materials into local water systems, improper disposal of research chemicals, modification of natural drainage patterns without permits, the CAS attorney recited. All potential violations of state environmental regulations. Marcus realized he was facing a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to turn his environmental research into environmental crimes. Every action he'd taken to document CAS's contamination of the marsh was being reframed as a legal activity that threatened their operations. I want to consult with an attorney before answering any more questions, Marcus said. Sheriff Boudreau nodded. That's your right, Mr. Chen, but I want you to understand the seriousness of these complaints. Interference with agricultural operations is a felony in Louisiana. Environmental violations carry heavy fines and potential jail time. These aren't matters you want to take lightly. The meeting concluded with Marcus being given copies of the formal complaints and advised to cease all research activities on his property until the legal issues were resolved. He walked out of the sheriff's office feeling like he'd been ambushed by professionals who had turned his environmental activism into criminal accusations. His phone was buzzing with messages by the time he reached his truck. Dr. Mitchell, Dave, Kellner, Derek, Ryan, and several others had all tried to reach him. But the most urgent message was from his mother. Marcus, call me immediately. We need to talk. Helen Chun was waiting for him at her house, along with Derek and Ryan. The intervention atmosphere was even more intense than it had been during the previous family dinner. Sit down, Marcus, his mother said without preamble. We've been getting calls. What kind of calls? Derek answered. Legal inquiries. Business associates asking about your judgment and reliability. People wanting to know if you're stable, if you're making rational decisions. Someone's conducting a background investigation on you, Ryan added. They're contacting everyone in the family, asking about your financial situation, your mental health, your relationship with Dad. Marcus felt violated in a way that went beyond the legal and professional pressure he'd been experiencing. They're investigating my family? They're building a case, Helen said grimly. A case that you're not competent to own that property, that you're making decisions that endanger public safety and environmental integrity. Derek leaned forward with the expression he'd worn since childhood when delivering unwelcome truths. Marcus, this has gone too far. You're facing criminal charges, you're about to lose your job, and you're dragging the entire family into a legal mess that could destroy all of us. It's time to cut your losses, Ryan agreed. Sell the property, pay the legal fees, and get out of this situation before it gets worse. Marcus looked around at his family, seeing fear and frustration in their faces. They weren't trying to hurt him. They were trying to protect themselves and what they saw as his best interests. But they also didn't understand what was at stake, beyond his personal financial situation. If I sell the property, the ecosystem dies, Marcus said quietly. The contamination continues. the unique species disappear, and Dad's 40 years of research becomes meaningless. Dad's research was a hobby, Derek replied harshly. It wasn't worth destroying your life over, and it isn't worth destroying ours either. The conversation continued for 2 hours, but Marcus knew from the beginning that his family wouldn't support his decision to fight. They saw the situation in terms of personal cost and benefit, not in terms of environmental preservation or scientific significance. When Marcus finally left his mother's house, he felt more alone than he had since his father's death. His family, his employer, and local law enforcement were all pressuring him to abandon the marsh and accept defeat. Consolidated Agricultural Services had successfully isolated him and created a narrative in which he was the problem rather than the solution. But as Marcus drove toward the marsh for what might be his last visit as its owner, he thought about Dr. Mitchell's research, about the unique species that existed nowhere else on Earth, about the potential meteor impact site that could rewrite geological understanding of the region. Some things were worth fighting for, even when you had to fight alone. The stakes keep rising for Marcus, and his next decisions will determine everything. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, please like this video and share it with friends who love compelling drama. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. We have so much more to discover together. Marcus found Dr. Mitchell's research team in an advanced state of controlled chaos. Equipment was being packed into waterproof cases, data was being backed up to multiple storage devices, and everyone moved with the urgent efficiency of people who knew their time was running out. How bad is it? Marcus asked. Dr. Mitchell looked up from a laptop where she was transferring files. Bad enough. The university received formal complaints about our research methods, questions about our permits, and threats of legal action if we continue operating on contested property. Dr. Crawford, the geologist, was more blunt. Someone with serious legal resources is trying to shut down our work before we can complete the impact site analysis. How much more time do you need for a preliminary determination? Maybe 2 weeks of intensive sampling and analysis. For definitive proof that would hold up in federal court? 6 months minimum. Marcus felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him. If he sold the property to end the legal pressure, the research would be terminated and the empty evidence of both environmental contamination and geological significance would disappear. If he continued fighting, he faced criminal charges, financial ruin, and the destruction of his relationships with everyone he cared about. There might be another option, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. She had been working at a folding table covered with rock samples and geological maps, speaking little but observing everything. The preliminary evidence for impact origin is strong enough to trigger federal notification requirements. What does that mean? Marcus asked. It means we can request emergency protection status while the full analysis is completed. If the National Science Foundation agrees that this could be a significant impact site, they can invoke federal authority to protect the area during the investigation period. Dr. Mitchell looked skeptical. That's a big if, Elena. Emergency protection requires compelling evidence, not just preliminary indicators. Look at this. Dr. Vasquez spread her geological maps across the table. The circular formation, the mineral signatures, the magnetic anomalies, they all point to the same conclusion. This isn't just possibly an impact site. This is almost certainly an impact site, and potentially one of the most significant ever discovered in North America. Marcus studied the maps, seeing his property outlined in red ink, surrounded by data points and geological indicators. The evidence was impressive even to his untrained eye, patterns and signatures that seemed to radiate outward from a central point near the freshwater spring. How significant are we talking about? He asked. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves great storytelling, And subscribe to our channel for more incredible narratives. Dr. Crawford answered, "If our preliminary estimates are correct, this could be a crater from an impact that occurred approximately 65 million years ago. That would make it contemporary with the Chicxulub impact that killed the dinosaurs." Marcus felt his breath catch. "You're saying a dinosaur-killing asteroid hit my property?" "Not necessarily the same asteroid, but possibly an associated impact from the same time period. There's growing evidence that the mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period involved multiple impacts, not just the one in Mexico." Dr. Vasquez nodded enthusiastically. "The geological timeline matches perfectly. The mineral compositions we're finding are consistent with shocked materials from extraterrestrial impacts. The crater diameter suggests an object at least a kilometer across traveling at cosmic velocities." Marcus tried to process the implications. His 400 acres of worthless swampland might contain evidence of one of the most significant events in Earth's history, the cosmic catastrophe that ended the age of dinosaurs and paved the way for the rise of mammals. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then this site has national significance that goes far beyond environmental protection." "Global significance," Dr. Crawford corrected. "Impact sites from the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary are incredibly rare. Most have been destroyed by erosion, buried by sediment, or developed by human activity. An intact crater from that period would be invaluable for understanding planetary catastrophes." Marcus felt hope rising for the first time in days. "Can you file for emergency protection?" "I can try," Dr. Vasquez said. "But it requires signing off from multiple agencies, and the process usually takes months. We need something that can provide immediate protection while the paperwork moves through federal bureaucracy." Dr. Mitchell had been quiet during the geological discussion, but now she looked up with an expression Marcus had learned to recognize, the look of someone who had just solved a complex problem. "What if we approach this from multiple angles?" she said. "Elena files for geological protection through NSF and NASA. I file for ecological protection through EPA and Fish and Wildlife. Marcus files civil rights complaints alleging harassment and intimidation designed to interfere with legitimate scientific research." "Civil rights complaints?" Marcus asked. "You're being targeted because you're conducting environmental research that threatens corporate interests. That falls under federal whistleblower protections and civil rights statutes. If we can document the pattern of harassment and intimidation, it becomes a federal case that supersedes local law enforcement." Dr. Crawford was nodding. "Multiple federal agencies, multiple legal theories, multiple grounds for protection. Even if some of the applications are denied, others might be approved." Marcus felt the pieces of a strategy coming together. Instead of fighting Consolidated Agricultural Services on their chosen battleground local politics and economic pressure, he could force the conflict into federal jurisdiction where corporate influence was diluted and scientific evidence carried more weight. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Documentation," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Every threat, every instance of harassment, every attempt to interfere with research activities. Phone records, email correspondence, witness statements, anything that establishes a pattern of systematic intimidation." Marcus thought about his conversations with Sutherland, the pressure at his workplace, the sheriff's office meeting, and the investigation of his family. "I can provide that. We also need to move fast," Dr. Vasquez added. "If CAS realizes what we're planning, they'll escalate their legal action to prevent federal agencies from getting involved." The research team spent the rest of the day implementing their strategy. Equipment was relocated to more secure positions. Data was transmitted to university servers beyond local reach, and documentation was prepared from multiple federal agencies. Marcus found himself in the strange position of being part of a scientific resistance movement, protecting research and evidence from corporate and political pressure. His phone rang repeatedly throughout the day. Calls from Dave Kellner about his employment situation, from Derek about the family's reputation, from reporters who had somehow learned about the legal disputes surrounding his property. Marcus ignored most of them, focusing on the federal protection applications that might represent his only chance of survival. But one call he couldn't ignore came from Sheriff Boudreaux. "Mr. Chen, I need you to come back to my office. We've got new developments in the investigation." "What kind of developments?" "The kind that require immediate attention." "How soon can you be here?" Marcus looked around at the research team, all of them working frantically to preserve their work and protect their evidence. "I'll be there in an hour." "Make it 30 minutes. "Mr. Chen, this is urgent." The drive into town felt like traveling from one world to another, from the natural beauty and scientific excitement of the marsh to the political and legal complexities of human conflict. Marcus found himself wondering if his father had ever faced similar pressure during his 40 years of research, or if the environmental movement had simply become more threatening to corporate interests since Thomas Chen's time. Sheriff Boudreaux was waiting with the same CA's representatives from the previous meeting, but now they were joined by a new figure, a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh, senior partner at a New Orleans law firm that specialized in environmental litigation. "Mr. Chen," Walsh began without preamble, "my clients are prepared to make you a generous offer to resolve this situation amicably." Marcus sat down cautiously. "What kind of offer?" "Consolidated Agricultural Services is willing to purchase your property for significantly above market value, $50,000 for land you bought for $8,000. In addition, they'll drop all legal complaints and cover your attorney fees for any civil matters that arise from this dispute." Marcus did quick math in his head. $50,000 would pay off his debts, cover his legal expenses, and provide enough capital to start over somewhere else. It was more than 6 times what he'd paid for the property, and probably more than he could expect to get from any other buyer. It was also exactly the kind of reasonable-sounding offer that would be impossible to refuse without seeming irrational or greedy. "There are conditions, of course," Walsh continued. "You would need to cease all research activities immediately, transfer all data and samples to Consolidated Agricultural Services for proper disposal, and sign agreements preventing you from making public statements about alleged environmental violations. You want me to turn over scientific evidence to the company that evidence implicates. We want to ensure that any materials collected from disputed property are handled through appropriate legal channels rather than being used to support unfounded accusations." Sheriff Boudreaux leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, this is a fair offer that resolves everyone's concerns. Your legal problems disappear, you make a substantial profit on your investment, and the community avoids a long, expensive court battle that nobody wants." Marcus realized he was facing the classic corporate strategy for dealing with environmental opposition. Make the cost of fighting higher than the benefit of winning, then offer a buyout that seems reasonable compared to the alternative of legal and financial destruction. "I need time to consider this," Marcus said. "I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have," Walsh replied. "The legal complaints against you are moving forward. Criminal charges could be filed as early as tomorrow. This offer expires at 5 p.m. today." 5 p.m.? That's less than 4 hours. Environmental crimes are serious matters, Mr. Chen. The longer this situation continues, the more difficult it becomes to resolve through negotiation rather than prosecution. Marcus left the sheriff's office, feeling like a man being pushed toward a cliff by people who were simultaneously offering to catch him if he jumped. The buyout offer was financially attractive and legally safe, but it would mean abandoning everything his father had worked for and allowing the destruction of an ecosystem that might be scientifically invaluable. He drove back to the marsh to find the research team in the final stages of their emergency protection applications. Dr. Vasquez was on a conference call with someone at NASA headquarters. Dr. Crawford was uploading geological data to NSF servers, and Dr. Mitchell was drafting environmental impact statements for multiple federal agencies. How did it go? Dr. Mitchell asked when she saw his expression. Marcus explained the buyout offer and the 5 p.m. deadline. The research team stopped their work to listen, and when he finished, the silence was profound. $50,000 is a lot of money. Dr. Crawford said finally. It's also the end of this research, Dr. Vasquez replied. If CAS gets control of the property, they'll have it developed or altered before any federal protections can be implemented. Dr. Mitchell was more direct. Marcus, we can't make this decision for you. You're facing real legal and financial consequences. If you take the buyout, no one would blame you. Marcus looked around at the marsh, at the ancient trees and clear water and subtle signs of life that had fascinated his father for 40 years. He thought about the unique species that existed nowhere else on Earth, about the potential evidence of cosmic catastrophe that could reshape scientific understanding of planetary evolution. He also thought about his father's research notes, about Thomas Chen's dedication to protecting this place despite family skepticism and social indifference. His father had never faced the kind of coordinated pressure Marcus was experiencing, but he had persisted through decades of quiet opposition to preserve something he believed was irreplaceable. What are the chances that the federal protection applications will be approved? Marcus asked. Dr. Vasquez looked uncertain. For the geological protection? Maybe 60% if we can provide enough preliminary evidence. The impact site hypothesis is compelling, but federal agencies are conservative about emergency protections. For the environmental protection, Marcus asked Dr. Mitchell. Better odds, maybe 75%. The contamination evidence is solid, and federal agencies take water pollution seriously. But the process could take months, and you'd have to survive the legal pressure until then. Marcus checked his watch, 2:15 p.m. He had less than 3 hours to decide between financial security and environmental protection, between personal safety and his father's legacy. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Mom says you're meeting with lawyers today. Please make the smart choice for once. Another text from Ryan. CAS stock is up 12% this quarter. These are people who know how to succeed. Maybe you should learn from them instead of fighting them. Marcus deleted both messages and walked to the observation platform where he had spent so many hours as a child, learning to appreciate the subtle beauty of Louisiana's wetland ecosystems. From here, he could see the entire property spread out, like a living map of ecological complexity and scientific potential. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitability. Marcus had inherited more than 400 acres of wetland. He had inherited a responsibility to protect something irreplaceable, even if that protection came at enormous personal cost. He pulled out his phone and called Jennifer Walsh. Ms. Walsh, this is Marcus Chen. I'm calling about your offer. Mr. Chen, I hope you've had time to consider the benefits of resolving this situation cooperatively. I have, and I'm declining your offer. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for Marcus to wonder if the call had been dropped. Mr. Chen, Walsh said finally, I want to make sure you understand the consequences of that decision. Criminal charges will be filed. Civil litigation will proceed. Your legal costs will be substantial, and your chances of prevailing against our resources are minimal, I understand. Then you're making a serious mistake that will affect the rest of your life. Marcus looked out over the marsh, at the place where his father had spent 40 years documenting life and where scientists were now discovering evidence of ancient death, the cosmic impact that had reshaped Earth's evolutionary history 65 million years ago. Maybe, Marcus said. But some mistakes are worth making. He hung up and walked back to the research team, who were watching him with expressions of respect and concern. "Well?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "We're going to fight," Marcus said. "All of us together, for as long as it takes." Dr. Vasquez smiled for the first time in days. "Then we'd better get these protection applications submitted before 5 o'clock. The next few hours passed in a blur of federal paperwork, scientific documentation, and legal strategy. By 4:45 p.m., emergency protection applications had been filed with the National Science Foundation, NASA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Civil rights complaints alleging harassment and intimidation had been submitted to the Department of Justice and the FBI. Marcus had committed himself to a battle he might not be able to win, against opponents with resources he couldn't match, for reasons his own family couldn't understand. But he had also positioned himself as the protector of something that might be more valuable than anyone had imagined. Window into Earth's most catastrophic moment, and the birthplace of the modern world. As the sun set over the Blackwater Marsh, Marcus Chen prepared for the fight of his life. The federal response came faster than anyone had expected. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, Marcus was awakened by his phone ringing. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. area code. "Mr. Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Hoffman with NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office. I'm calling about your emergency protection application regarding a potential impact site in Louisiana." Marcus sat up in bed, instantly alert. "Yes, Dr. Hoffman. Thank you for calling so quickly. Mr. Chen, the preliminary data you submitted is remarkable. We've reviewed the geological surveys, the mineral analysis, and the topographical evidence. If your researchers' hypotheses are correct, you may be sitting on one of the most significant paleontological discoveries in North American history." Marcus felt his heart racing. "Does that mean you'll approve emergency protection?" "It means we're dispatching a federal assessment team immediately. They'll arrive this afternoon to conduct independent verification of the impact site evidence. If their findings support your application, we can invoke emergency archaeological and geological protections under federal law." "What does that mean for the legal situation?" "It means that any interference with the site during the federal investigation period would constitute obstruction of a federal scientific inquiry. That carries serious criminal penalties that supersede local and state jurisdictions." Marcus thanked Dr. Hoffman and immediately called Dr. Vasquez to share the news. Her response was a mixture of excitement and caution. "This is incredible, Marcus, but it also raises the stakes dramatically. If NASA confirms this as a significant impact site, the property value increases by orders of magnitude. We're not just talking about scientific importance anymore. We're talking about potential mineral rights, tourism revenue, and commercial development opportunities worth millions of dollars." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. "You're saying this makes me more of a target, not less." "I'm saying that Consolidated Agricultural Services just learned they tried to buy a potential gold mine for $50,000. They're not going to be happy about that miscalculation." Dr. Vasquez was right. By 10 a.m., Marcus had received 3 phone calls that confirmed his worst fears. The first was from Sheriff Boudreaux, informing him that additional criminal charges were being filed related to interference with ongoing federal investigations and fraudulent claims about property value. The second was from Dave Kellner, who had been contacted by CAS attorneys threatening to sue Environmental Solutions, Inc. for conspiracy to defraud if they continued employing Marcus. The third was from his mother, who had been visited by private investigators asking detailed questions about Marcus's mental health and financial stability. But the most disturbing call came from Jennifer Walsh, the CS attorney, whose tone had shifted from professional courtesy to barely contained hostility. "Mr. Chen, you've made a serious error in judgment. My clients offered you a generous settlement, And you responded by making fraudulent claims about your property's geological significance. The claims aren't fraudulent. NASA is sending a team to verify. NASA is sending a team because you provided misleading information designed to inflate your property's value and avoid legitimate legal consequences. That's fraud, Mr. Chen, and it's a federal crime. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him again. Kaz wasn't just dismissing the scientific evidence. They were reframing it as part of an elaborate scheme to defraud them out of money and avoid criminal prosecution. The geological evidence is real, Marcus said. Independent researchers from LSU documented everything. Researchers you're paying, using data you provided, studying property you own. That's not independent, Mr. Chen. That's a conspiracy to manufacture false evidence. The conversation continued for 10 minutes, with Walsh outlining a legal theory that turned Marcus's environmental activism and scientific collaboration into criminal conspiracy. According to CAS's version of events, Marcus had deliberately misled federal agencies about his property's significance in order to avoid prosecution for environmental crimes and increase his leverage in settlement negotiations. It was a sophisticated reframing that had the advantage of being partially plausible. Marcus was paying LSU for research access. He had provided the historical data that formed the basis of their studies, and he did have financial motivations for wanting his property to be protected by federal agencies. When Walsh hung up, Marcus sat in his apartment trying to understand how quickly his situation had deteriorated. 24 hours earlier, he had been facing local criminal charges and pressure to sell his property. Now he was potentially facing federal fraud charges and accusations of conspiring to deceive NASA, the EPA, and other agencies. His phone rang. Again, Dr. Mitchell's name appeared on the screen. Marcus, we have a problem. The university just received a formal complaint alleging research misconduct and academic fraud. They're launching an investigation into our work on your property. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What kind of investigation? Internal review of our methodology, our funding sources, our relationship with you as both a research subject and a financial contributor. They're questioning whether our scientific conclusions were influenced by your financial interests. Were they? Of course not. But the appearance of conflict of interest is enough to cast doubt on our work. The university is suspending our research activities pending the investigation. Marcus stared out his apartment window at the parking lot below, watching normal people go about their normal lives, while his own life unraveled with increasing speed. CAS wasn't just fighting him, they were systematically destroying the scientific and legal foundation of his case by attacking the credibility of everyone involved. What about the NASA assessment team? Still coming, as far as I know. But they'll be evaluating contaminated evidence from researchers under investigation for misconduct. That changes the weight of our conclusions significantly. Marcus thanked Dr. Mitchell and hung up, then sat in silence for several minutes. He was beginning to understand the true scope of what he was up against. Consolidated Agricultural Services wasn't just a farming operation. It was a corporate entity with the resources and expertise to wage legal warfare on multiple fronts simultaneously. They were attacking his credibility, his researchers' integrity, his family's reputation, and his financial stability. They were reframing his environmental activism as criminal conspiracy and his scientific collaboration as academic fraud. Most importantly, they were doing it all fast enough to undermine federal protection efforts before they could be implemented. Marcus was contemplating the implications when his doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he could see two people in dark suits holding credentials. Federal agents. Mr. Chen, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. This is Agent James Park. We'd like to ask you some questions about allegations of fraud involving federal agencies. Marcus let them in, knowing he had no choice, but also knowing that anything he said could be used against him later. The agents were professional and polite, but their questions made it clear that someone had provided them with detailed allegations about his supposed scheme to defraud NASA and other agencies. Mr. Chen, can you explain your relationship with the researchers from LSU who provided geological data for your federal protection applications? Marcus explained the legitimate research collaboration, the university's interest in his property's biodiversity, and the accidental discovery of possible impact site evidence. But as he talked, he could see how the facts could be interpreted differently by people who started with the assumption that he was guilty of fraud. And you paid the university for research access? I paid standard fees for collaborative research. It's a normal arrangement. Did you provide historical data that influenced their conclusions? I provided my father's research notes from 40 years of environmental monitoring. They used that as baseline data for their studies. Agent Park took notes while Agent Martinez asked follow-up questions. Mr. Chen, did you stand to benefit financially if federal agencies designated your property as scientifically significant? Marcus hesitated, knowing that any answer would be problematic. The designation would protect the property from development or contamination, which preserves its value. But that's true for any environmental protection. But it would also prevent you from being forced to sell the property to resolve legal issues related to environmental crimes, correct? Marcus realized he was being led through a line of questioning designed to establish motive for fraud. Every truthful answer reinforced the narrative that he had manipulated federal agencies to avoid prosecution and increase his negotiating position. The interview continued for 2 hours, covering his relationship with the research team, his knowledge of geological significance, his motivations for seeking federal protection, and his communications with various agencies. When the agents finally left, Marcus felt like a man who had been politely but thoroughly dissected. His phone was buzzing with missed calls and messages. Derek had called 4 times. Ryan had left 2 voicemails. His mother had sent a text. FBI agents were at my house asking about you. Call me immediately. Marcus ignored them all and drove out to the marsh, needing to see the place that had become the center of a legal and scientific storm. He found the property cordoned off with yellow tape marked Federal Investigation Area, no unauthorized access. A government SUV was parked near the gate, and Marcus could see people in the distance taking measurements and collecting samples. The NASA assessment team had arrived and was conducting their own investigation of the geological evidence. Marcus sat in his truck outside the gate, watching federal scientists work on his property while he was prohibited from entering. The irony was bitter. The land he had inherited and fought to protect was now beyond his reach, controlled by the same federal agencies he had asked for help. Dr. Crawford appeared at the gate and walked over to Marcus's truck. How's it going? Marcus asked. Dr. Crawford looked exhausted. The federal team is finding everything we found and more. This is definitely an impact site, and it's bigger than we initially estimated. The crater diameter is at least 15 kilometers, possibly 20. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and despair. So we were right. We were more right than we knew. This isn't just any impact site, it's a major crater from the Chicxulub event. We're looking at one of the impacts that killed the dinosaurs. What does that mean? It means your property is sitting on geological formations worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. Shocked minerals, rare earth elements, diamonds formed under extreme pressure. The commercial applications are staggering. Marcus stared at the federal investigation taking place on his land. And none of that matters if I'm in federal prison for fraud. Dr. Crawford nodded grimly. The federal team is aware of the criminal allegations. They're being very careful to conduct independent analysis that can't be challenged on procedural grounds. That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment to find Derek and Ryan waiting in the parking lot. Their expressions suggested they weren't there for a social visit. We need to talk, Derek said without preamble, about your situation and how it's affecting the family. They went upstairs to Marcus's apartment, where Ryan immediately began outlining the legal and financial exposure the entire family was facing because of Marcus's actions. "Private investigators are contacting everyone we know," Ryan said. "They're asking about family finances, business relationships, personal history. Our professional reputations are being damaged by association with you." Derek was more direct. "Marcus, you've lost your mind. You're facing federal fraud charges over a piece of swampland that you could have sold for a profit. Instead, you've created a situation that could destroy all of us." Marcus tried to explain about the scientific significance, about the potential impact site, about the irreplaceable ecosystem his father had spent decades protecting. But his brothers weren't interested in environmental conservation or geological discovery. "Even if everything you're saying is true," Derek said, "even if that land is scientifically important, it doesn't matter if you're in prison. You can't protect anything from a federal penitentiary. And you can't protect anything if you sell it to the company that's been contaminating it for 20 years. Marcus replied. Ryan pulled out his laptop and showed Marcus a news article from that morning's newspaper. Local man accused of defrauding federal agencies in environmental scheme. The article painted Marcus as a desperate property owner who had manufactured false evidence about his land's scientific value in order to avoid prosecution for environmental crimes. It quoted unnamed sources describing him as financially unstable and prone to making poor decisions under pressure. "This is what people are reading about you," Ryan said. "This is how you're being described in the community where we all live and work." Derek leaned forward with the expression he'd worn since childhood when delivering ultimatums. "Marcus, the family is cutting ties with you until this situation is resolved. We can't afford to be associated with someone who's under federal investigation for fraud." Marcus looked at his brothers, seeing fear and frustration and a complete lack of understanding for what he was trying to accomplish. They viewed his environmental activism as a personal failing that was endangering their own security and reputation. "What about Dad's research?" Marcus asked. "What about 40 years of environmental monitoring and conservation work?" "Dad's research was a hobby that you've turned into a federal crime," Derek replied harshly. "He never asked you to destroy your life protecting a swamp." The conversation continued for another hour, but the outcome was predetermined. Derek and Ryan were distancing themselves from Marcus to protect their own interests, leaving him to face the legal and financial consequences of his decisions alone. "And you paid the university for research access?" "I paid standard fees for collaborative research. It's a normal arrangement." "Did you provide historical data that influenced their conclusions?" "I provided my father's research notes from 40 years of environmental monitoring. They used that as baseline data for their studies." Agent Park took notes while Agent Martinez asked follow-up questions. "Mr. Chen, did you stand to benefit financially if federal agencies designated your property as scientifically significant?" Marcus hesitated, knowing that any answer would be problematic. The designation would protect the property from development or contamination, which preserves its value. But that's true for any environmental protection. But it would also prevent you from being forced to sell the property to resolve legal issues related to environmental crimes, correct? Marcus realized he was being led through a line of questioning designed to establish motive for fraud. Every truthful answer reinforced the narrative that he had manipulated federal agencies to avoid prosecution and increase his negotiating position. The interview continued for 2 hours, covering his relationship with the research team, his knowledge of geological significance, his motivations for seeking federal protection, and his communications with various agencies. When the agents finally left, Marcus felt like a man who had been politely but thoroughly dissected. His phone was buzzing with missed calls and messages. Derek had called 4 times. Ryan had left 2 voicemails. His mother had sent a text. "FBI agents were at my house asking about you. Call me immediately." Marcus ignored them all and drove out to the marsh, needing to see the place that had become the center of a legal and scientific storm. He found the property cordoned off with yellow tape marked Federal Investigation Area, no unauthorized access. A government SUV was parked near the gate, and Marcus could see people in the distance taking measurements and collecting samples. The NASA assessment team had arrived and was conducting their own investigation of the geological evidence. Marcus sat in his truck outside the gate, watching federal scientists work on his property while he was prohibited from entering. The irony was bitter. The land he had inherited and fought to protect was now beyond his reach, controlled by the same federal agencies he had asked for help. Dr. Crawford appeared at the gate and walked over to Marcus's truck. "How's it going?" Marcus asked. Dr. Crawford looked exhausted. "The federal team is finding everything we found and more. This is definitely an impact site, and it's bigger than we initially estimated. The crater diameter is at least 15 kilometers, possibly 20. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and despair. So we were right. We were more right than we knew. This isn't just any impact site, it's a major crater from the Chicxulub event. We're looking at one of the impacts that killed the dinosaurs. What does that mean? It means your property is sitting on geological formations worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. Shocked minerals, rare earth elements, diamonds formed under extreme pressure. The commercial applications are staggering." Marcus stared at the federal investigation taking place on his land. "And none of that matters if I'm in federal prison for fraud." Dr. Crawford nodded grimly. "The federal team is aware of the criminal allegations. They're being very careful to conduct independent analysis that can't be challenged on procedural grounds." That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment to find Derek and Ryan waiting in the parking lot. Their expressions suggested they weren't there for a social visit. "We need to talk," Derek said without preamble. "About your situation and how it's affecting the family." They went upstairs to Marcus's apartment, where Ryan immediately began outlining the legal and financial exposure the entire family was facing because of Marcus's actions. "Private investigators are contacting everyone we know," Ryan said. "They're asking about family finances, business relationships, personal history. Our professional reputations are being damaged by association with you." Derek was more direct. "Marcus, you've lost your mind. You're facing federal fraud charges over a piece of swampland that you could have sold for a profit. Instead, you've created a situation that could destroy all of us." Marcus tried to explain about the scientific significance, about the potential impact site, about the irreplaceable ecosystem his father had spent decades protecting. But his brothers weren't interested in environmental conservation or geological discovery. "Even if everything you're saying is true," Derek said, "even if that land is scientifically important, it doesn't matter if you're in prison. You can't protect anything from a federal penitentiary. And you can't protect anything if you sell it to the company that's been contaminating it for 20 years. Marcus replied. Ryan pulled out his laptop and showed Marcus a news article from that morning's newspaper. Local man accused of defrauding federal agencies in environmental scheme. The article painted Marcus as a desperate property owner who had manufactured false evidence about his land's scientific value in order to avoid prosecution for environmental crimes. It quoted unnamed sources describing him as financially unstable and prone to making poor decisions under pressure. "This is what people are reading about you," Ryan said. "This is how you're being described in the community where we all live and work." Derek leaned forward with the expression he'd worn since childhood when delivering ultimatums. "Marcus, the family is cutting ties with you until this situation is resolved. We can't afford to be associated with someone who's under federal investigation for fraud." Marcus looked at his brothers, seeing fear and frustration and a complete lack of understanding for what he was trying to accomplish. They viewed his environmental activism as a personal failing that was endangering their own security and reputation. "What about Dad's research?" Marcus asked. "What about 40 years of environmental monitoring and conservation work?" "Dad's research was a hobby that you've turned into a federal crime," Derek replied harshly. "He never asked you to destroy your life protecting a swamp." The conversation continued for another hour, but the outcome was predetermined. Derek and Ryan were distancing themselves from Marcus to protect their own interests, leaving him to face the legal and financial consequences of his decisions alone. After his brothers left, Marcus sat in his apartment as darkness fell outside. His phone showed 17 missed calls, 43 unread text messages, and dozens of emails from reporters, lawyers, and people he didn't recognize. He turned it off and sat in silence, trying to understand how completely his life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, he had been a project manager at an environmental consulting firm, living a quiet life and avoiding family conflicts. Now he was under federal investigation, unemployed, estranged from his family, and facing legal battles that could result in years in prison. But he was also the owner of what might be one of the most significant geological sites in North America, the protector of an ecosystem that existed nowhere else on Earth, and the guardian of his father's scientific legacy. The question was whether those achievements would matter if he lost everything else in the process. Marcus looked out his window at the lights of the city, at the evidence of human civilization that had grown up around and over the natural world. His father had dedicated his life to studying. Somewhere out in the darkness, the Blackwater Marsh waited under federal protection, its secrets being carefully extracted by government scientists who would determine its future and his own. He had made his choice to fight, and now he would face the consequences. The only question was whether he would survive long enough to see whether his sacrifice had been worth making. The next morning brought news that changed everything once again. Dr. Hoffman from NASA called at 6 a.m. with an update on the federal assessment. "Mr. Chen, I have preliminary results from our investigation team. The geological evidence is not just significant, it's extraordinary." Marcus sat up in bed, instantly alert. What did they find? Definitive proof of cosmic impact origin, dating to approximately 66.5 million years ago. Mineral compositions consistent with extraterrestrial objects, shocked quartz formations, and most importantly, organic compounds that may represent preserved biological material from the impact event. Marcus felt his heart racing. Preserved biological material? Fossils, Mr. Chen. Not just any fossils, potentially the last dinosaurs to die in North America. Preserved in the geological formations created by the impact that killed them. Your property may contain direct physical evidence of the most significant extinction event in Earth's history. Marcus tried to process the implications. He wasn't just the owner of an impact site, he was the owner of a paleontological treasure that could revolutionize understanding of how the dinosaurs died. "Dr. Hoffman, what does this mean for the legal situation?" "It means your property is now under emergency federal protection as a site of exceptional scientific significance. Any interference with ongoing research, any attempt to alter or develop the property, any harassment of the property owner, all of that now falls under federal jurisdiction as obstruction of national scientific priorities." Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with disbelief. "And the fraud allegations?" "Mr. Chen, you can't defraud the federal government by providing evidence of legitimate scientific discoveries. The criminal complaints against you are being dismissed, and the Justice Department is launching an investigation into whether you were the victim of corporate harassment and intimidation." Marcus thanked Dr. Hoffman and hung up, then sat in his bed trying to absorb the reversal of fortune he had just experienced. In the space of a single phone call, he'd gone from potential federal criminal to protected witness in a government investigation of corporate misconduct. His phone immediately rang again. This time it was Dr. Mitchell, calling from the research site. "Marcus, you need to get out here immediately. The federal team has made a discovery that's going to change everything." What kind of discovery? They found the impact layer. The actual geological boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods. And Marcus, they found something in it that's worth more than anyone imagined. Marcus drove to the marsh with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, unsure what to expect but knowing that his life was about to change again. The federal investigation site had expanded overnight, with additional vehicles, equipment, and personnel suggesting a major scientific undertaking. Dr. Hoffman met him at the gate, her expression a mixture of professional composure and barely contained excitement. "Mr. Chen, welcome to one of the most significant paleontological sites in world history. What we're about to show you will redefine our understanding of extinction events and possibly unlock commercial applications worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Marcus followed her toward the excavation area, where federal scientists were carefully extracting materials from precisely defined geological layers. The work looked more like archaeology than geology, with each sample being photographed, measured, and cataloged before removal. "The impact layer is remarkably well preserved," Dr. Hoffman explained as they walked. "Usually these formations are disturbed by millions of years of geological activity. But the unique hydrology of your marsh created conditions that preserved everything in near-perfect condition." They reached an observation platform that had been constructed overlooking the main excavation. Marcus looked down into a carefully gridded pit where scientists were working with tools that looked more appropriate for delicate surgery than geological fieldwork. "What exactly are they extracting?" Marcus asked. Dr. Crawford appeared beside them, holding a clear plastic container with something that looked like dark, crystalline rock. "This, Marcus, is why your brothers are going to regret mocking your inheritance." Marcus examined the container, seeing what appeared to be ordinary geological specimens. "What am I looking at?" "Shocked diamonds," Dr. Crawford said with obvious excitement. "Diamonds formed by the extreme pressure and temperature of cosmic impact. They're incredibly rare, scientifically valuable, and commercially worth approximately $2,000 per carat." Marcus felt his knees weaken. "How many carats are we talking about?" Dr. Hoffman answered. "Our preliminary survey suggests your property contains approximately $14 million worth of shocked diamonds in easily accessible geological layers." Marcus stared at the small container, trying to process the numbers. $14 million. From the worthless Swampland his brothers had mocked him for buying. "But that's not the most valuable discovery," Dr. Crawford continued. "Show him the iridium." Dr. Hoffman produced another container, this one holding what looked like metallic flakes mixed with ordinary sediment. "Iridium is extremely rare on Earth but common in asteroids. The impact deposited massive quantities in a concentrated layer that's accessible through standard mining techniques." "How valuable is iridium?" Marcus asked. "Current market price is approximately $1,500 per ounce. Our estimates suggest your property contains at least 800 pounds of recoverable iridium ore." Marcus did quick calculations in his head. 800 pounds at $1,500 per ounce meant $19 million, Dr. Hoffman said, reading his expression. "And that's just from surface accessible deposits. Deeper excavation could yield significantly more." Marcus sat down heavily on a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the financial implications of what he was hearing. The property he had bought for $8,000 and been pressured to sell for $50,000 contained mineral deposits worth over $30 million. "There's more," Dr. Crawford said. "The preserved biological material we mentioned earlier. It includes soft tissue preservation that's unprecedented in the fossil record, that has commercial applications for biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and genetic research that could be worth even more than the mineral deposits." Marcus looked around at the federal investigation taking place on his property, at the scientists carefully extracting materials that represented both scientific breakthroughs and commercial opportunities beyond anything he had imagined. What Happens now? He asked. Dr. Hoffman smiled. Now, Mr. Chen, you become one of the wealthiest landowners in Louisiana. The federal government will be negotiating with you for research access. Mining companies will be competing for extraction rights. And academic institutions worldwide will be seeking permission to study your property. And Consolidated Agricultural Services is about to discover that they tried to intimidate the owner of a site worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's going to make for some very uncomfortable conversations with their shareholders and legal departments. Marcus thought about his brother's mockery, about his family's pressure to sell, about the corporate intimidation he had endured for protecting what everyone dismissed as worthless wetland. His father had been right to preserve the Blackwater Marsh. Thomas Chen had spent 40 years protecting an ecosystem that turned out to contain evidence of Earth's most dramatic moment and commercial resources beyond imagination. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Derek. Derek, it's Marcus. I wanted to update you on the swamp situation. Marcus, we told you we can't be associated with you while you're under federal investigation. The federal investigation cleared me completely. In fact, the government is now investigating Consolidated Agricultural Services for harassment. Intimidation. Derek's tone shifted slightly. That's good news. I'm glad the legal issues are being resolved. There's more. The geological survey results came back. The property contains mineral deposits worth approximately $30 million. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Marcus wondered if the call had been dropped. $30 million, Derek said finally. That's the conservative estimate. Could be significantly more with full excavation and commercial development. Another long silence. Then, Marcus, we should probably meet to discuss the family's involvement in this situation. There might be ways we can help you manage this opportunity. Marcus smiled, looking out over the federal investigation site, where scientists were carefully extracting the wealth his family had convinced him to abandon. Thanks for the offer, Derek, but I think I can manage this opportunity just fine on my own. He hung up and turned to Dr. Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman, how quickly can we get commercial extraction rights organized? I have some debts to pay off and some brothers to surprise. The transformation of Marcus Chen from struggling property owner to multimillionaire had taken place in less than 24 hours. But the implications of that transformation would take much longer to fully understand, both for Marcus and for everyone who had underestimated the value of protecting the natural world. Both for Marcus and for everyone who had underestimated the value of protecting the natural world. Media attention began 3 days after the federal announcement of the discovery. By the end of the week, Marcus found himself at the center of a national story that combined environmental protection, scientific discovery, and sudden wealth in ways that fascinated reporters and the public alike. The headlines told the story. In increasingly sensational terms, Swampland inheritance yields $280 million in ancient treasures. Louisiana man discovers dinosaur killer asteroid site in backyard. From $8,000 to $280 million, the ultimate real estate investment. The dollar figures had increased as more detailed geological surveys revealed the true scope of the mineral deposits. Beyond the shocked diamonds and iridium, the impact site contained rare earth elements, platinum group metals, and geological formations that had commercial applications. Marcus was still learning to understand, but with the media attention came complications Marcus hadn't anticipated. His phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, mining companies, investment firms, and people claiming to be long-lost relatives. His apartment building was surrounded by news trucks and curiosity seekers. Most disturbingly, he had started receiving threats from people who believed he had stolen public resources or manipulated the system for personal gain. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically as well. Derek and Ryan were now eager to discuss their supportive role in Marcus's decision to preserve the property. His mother had stopped mentioning his poor judgment and started asking about investment opportunities and family trust funds. I always knew that land was special, Helen Chun told a reporter from CNN. My late husband spent years studying it, and we supported Marcus's decision to honor his father's wishes. Marcus watched the interview from his temporary hotel room, marveling at his family's ability to rewrite history to position themselves as supporters rather than critics of his environmental activism. Dr. Mitchell knocked on his door as the news segment ended. She had been staying at the same hotel while coordinating the ongoing research activities with federal agencies. "How are you holding up?" she asked, noting the exhaustion in his face. "I'm not sure," Marcus admitted. "A month ago, I was worried about making my rent. Now I own mineral rights worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and I don't know what to do with any of it." Dr. Mitchell sat down across from him. "The research team has been discussing that. We have some suggestions about how to handle the commercial development while preserving the scientific value of the site." "I'm listening." "The key is maintaining control of the property while licensing specific extraction rights to qualified companies. You could establish a foundation that owns the land, generates revenue from commercial activities, and funds ongoing research and conservation efforts." Marcus had been thinking along similar lines. Like a nature preserve that pays for itself through sustainable resource extraction. Exactly. The impact site contains enough valuable materials to fund decades of scientific research while preserving the ecosystem that made the discovery possible. It was an elegant solution that honored his father's conservation goals while capitalizing on the economic opportunities the discovery had created. Marcus could become wealthy while ensuring that the Blackwater Marsh remained protected for future generations of researchers and wildlife. But implementing that vision was proving more complicated than Marcus had anticipated. The legal frameworks for managing geological discoveries on private property were complex, involving federal agencies, state regulations, environmental protections, and commercial interests that often conflicted with each other. Marcus's phone rang, interrupting his conversation with Dr. Mitchell. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Mr. Chun, this is Bill Sutherland. I think we need to have another conversation." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had assumed that Consolidated Agricultural Services would retreat after the federal investigation cleared him and revealed the true value of his property. Apparently, he had underestimated their persistence. "What do you want, Sutherland?" "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding we had earlier. It's clear that we didn't fully appreciate the situation, and I'd like the opportunity to make things right." Marcus was immediately suspicious. What kind of opportunity? "A business partnership. CAS has experience managing large-scale extraction, operations, environmental compliance, and regulatory relationships. You have a valuable resource that needs professional development. We could work together to maximize the value of your discovery while ensuring responsible environmental practices." "After you tried to intimidate me into selling for $50,000, Sutherland's tone remained carefully professional. "Business negotiations can get heated, Mr. Chen. What matters now is moving forward in a way that benefits everyone involved." Marcus thought about the systematic pressure campaign CAs had waged against him, the threats to his employment, the investigation of his family, and the criminal charges they had supported. The idea of partnering with them felt like betraying everything he had fought to protect. "I'm not interested in working with your company," Marcus said. "Mr. Chun, I hope you'll reconsider. The extraction industry is more complicated than most people realize. Environmental regulations, safety requirements, community relations. There are a lot of ways for inexperienced operators to make costly mistakes." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sutherland was suggesting that Marcus would face significant challenges if he tried to develop the property without CAS's cooperation. "Are you threatening me again, Sutherland?" "I'm offering you the benefit of our experience. But if you prefer to learn through trial and error, that's your choice. Just remember that mistakes in this industry can be expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes dangerous. Marcus hung up and immediately called Dr. Hoffman to report the contact from CAS. She wasn't surprised by Sutherland's approach. Corporate entities often try to insert themselves into valuable discoveries after the fact, she explained. They'll use their political connections, regulatory knowledge, and financial resources to create situations where cooperation becomes more attractive than independence. What kind of situations? Permit delays, environmental challenges, safety inspections, tax assessments. There are dozens of ways to make extraction operations difficult for property owners who don't have industry connections. Marcus realized he was facing a new phase of the same conflict that had nearly destroyed him weeks earlier. CAS wasn't giving up. They were adapting their strategy to the changed circumstances. The next few days brought evidence that Dr. Hoffman's warnings were justified. Marcus received notice that his property taxes were being reassessed based on the commercial development potential of the mineral deposits. Environmental groups filed lawsuits claiming that extraction activities would damage protected wetlands. State regulators announced comprehensive reviews of all permits and licenses related to the discovery. Each challenge was legitimate and legal, but the cumulative effect was to create a bureaucratic maze that would take months or years to navigate. Without experienced help, and the most experienced help in the region was offered by companies like Consolidated Agricultural Services. Marcus was studying regulatory documents in his hotel room when Derek called. Marcus, we need to talk. Mom's been contacted by some very serious people who have concerns about how you're handling this situation. What kind of concerns? Financial and legal concerns. Apparently, there are tax implications to sudden wealth that you haven't considered. Estate planning issues, investment strategies, liability protections. You need professional help. Marcus had been avoiding those complexities, focusing on the scientific and environmental aspects of the discovery while ignoring the business and legal realities. But Derek was right that he couldn't continue operating without professional financial and legal advice. I'll hire accountants and lawyers, Marcus said. It's not that simple. The people Mom talked to specialize in exactly this type of situation. They've helped other individuals manage sudden wealth from resource discoveries. They understand the tax codes, the regulatory environment, and the investment options. Who are these people? Derek paused before answering. They're affiliated with Consolidated Agricultural Services, but they're independent consultants who work with various clients in the extraction industry. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. So CAS is now trying to control my finances after failing to intimidate me out of the property. They're offering to help you navigate a complex situation that you're not equipped to handle alone. There's a difference between control and consultation. Marcus hung up without responding, but Derek's words stayed with him. He was overwhelmed by the legal, financial, and regulatory complexities of managing his discovery. Without professional help, he could easily make mistakes that would cost him millions of dollars or years of delays. But accepting help from CAS-affiliated consultants would give his former adversaries influence over his decision-making and potentially compromise his independence. Marcus was contemplating his options when Dr. Mitchell knocked on his door with an expression he had learned to associate with serious problems. Marcus, we have a situation at the research site. What kind of situation? Equipment sabotage. Someone destroyed several pieces of monitoring equipment and contaminated sample collection areas with industrial chemicals. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Sabotage? The federal security team thinks it was designed to compromise ongoing research and create environmental damage that could be blamed on extraction activities. Marcus drove out to the research site with Dr. Mitchell, finding federal investigators photographing damaged equipment and collecting evidence. The sabotage had been sophisticated and targeted, focusing on the most sensitive monitoring systems and sample storage areas. Agent Martinez from the FBI was coordinating the investigation. She approached Marcus with grim news. "Mr. Chen, this appears to be part of a coordinated effort to create legal and regulatory problems for your property development. The contamination was done using chemicals that match products used by agricultural operations. Consolidated Agricultural Services? We can't make accusations without proof, but the chemical signatures are consistent with compounds your former adversaries have access to." Marcus looked around at the damaged research equipment, at the contaminated sample areas that would take weeks to clean and months to reestablish. The sabotage had been designed to delay research activities and create environmental violations that could be used to justify regulatory intervention. "Agent Martinez, is this connected to the pressure campaign from earlier?" "We believe so. The pattern suggests escalation from harassment and intimidation to direct interference with federal research activities. That's a serious felony that carries substantial prison time." That evening, Marcus sat in his hotel room trying to understand the full scope of what he was facing. CAS wasn't just trying to intimidate him or insert themselves into his business operations. They were actively sabotaging federal research activities to create justification for regulatory intervention. His phone rang with a call from Jennifer Walsh, the CAS attorney who had offered him the original buyout. "Mr. Chen, I'm calling about the unfortunate incident at your research site." "Unfortunate incident? You mean the criminal sabotage?" "Mr. Chen, industrial accidents happen in complex extraction environments. The important thing is to prevent future incidents through proper safety protocols and experienced management." Marcus realized that Walsh was calling to claim credit for the sabotage while offering to prevent future accidents in exchange for cooperation. "Are you admitting that your client was responsible for destroying federal research equipment?" "I'm pointing out that extraction operations carry inherent risks that require professional management. My client has the experience and resources to minimize those risks through sabotage and intimidation, through proper safety protocols and industry best practices. The choice is yours, Mr. Chen. You can continue trying to manage this situation independently and risk further incidents, or you can accept professional assistance from people who understand the industry." Marcus hung up, finally understanding the full extent of CAS's strategy. They were creating problems they could then offer to solve, manufacturing crises that made their involvement seem necessary rather than opportunistic. But Marcus also understood that he was reaching the limits of his ability to fight them alone. The regulatory challenges, the legal complexities, the financial management requirements, and now the security threats were beyond what he could handle as an individual property owner. He needed allies, resources and expertise that matched what CAS could bring to bear against him. The question was where to find help that wouldn't compromise his independence or his father's conservation goals. Marcus looked out his hotel window at the lights of the city, at the evidence of human civilization that had been built on the foundation of natural resources extracted from places like the Blackwater Marsh. His father had spent 40 years protecting the ecosystem from exploitation, and Marcus had fought to continue that protection. Now he found himself in the strange position of needing to exploit the ecosystem's resources in order to preserve it, working with extraction companies to generate the revenue needed to fund conservation efforts. It was a complex balance that required skills Marcus didn't possess and allies he wasn't sure he could trust. But it was also the only path forward that honored both his father's environmental legacy and the economic realities of managing a geological discovery worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus picked up his phone and called Dr. Hoffman. "Dr. Hoffman, I need to ask you about something. Are there companies in the extraction industry that specialize in environmentally responsible resource development?" "There are, Mr. Chen. several firms that work specifically with geological discoveries on protected or environmentally sensitive properties. They understand how to balance commercial development with conservation requirements. Can you recommend some companies that aren't affiliated with Consolidated Agricultural Services? Dr. Hoffman paused. Are you having additional problems with CAS? Marcus explained the sabotage, the pressure campaign, and the attempts to force him into partnership arrangements he didn't want. Mr. Chen, you're dealing with a corporate entity that views your property as a threat to their operations and a source of potential revenue. They won't stop until they either control your development or destroy your ability to develop independently. So what do? You find allies who are stronger than they are. Companies with more resources, better political connections, and greater expertise in managing complex extraction operations. Do such companies exist? They do. And they're very interested in discoveries like yours, especially when those discoveries come with built-in environmental protection requirements that align with modern industry standards. Marcus felt hope rising for the first time in days. Can you make introductions? I can do better than that. I can arrange for you to meet with representatives from 3 different companies tomorrow. All of them specialize in exactly the type of situation you're facing. Marcus thanked Dr. Hoffman and hung up, feeling like he might finally have found a path forward that didn't require compromising his principles or abandoning his father's conservation mission. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation platform his father had built, watching the sunrise paint the marsh in shades of gold and crimson. The landscape looked much the same as it had during his childhood visits, but everything had changed. The partnership with Meridian Environmental Solutions had transformed the Blackwater Marsh into a model of sustainable resource extraction. The partnership with Meridian Environmental Solutions had transformed the Blackwater Marsh into a model of sustainable resource extraction. The partnership with Meridian Environmental Resolution had transformed the Blackwater Marsh into a sustainable model of sustainable resource extraction. Shocked diamonds and rare earth elements were being carefully harvested using techniques that preserve the ecosystem's delicate balance. The revenue funded a world-class research facility where scientists from dozens of universities studied both the ancient impact site and the unique biodiversity Marcus Chen had spent 40 years documenting. Derek and Ryan had eventually apologized, though their newfound enthusiasm for environmental conservation coincided suspiciously with their discovery that the family trust Marcus had established would provide them with substantial annual dividends. Helen Chen now proudly described herself as the mother of Louisiana's most successful environmental entrepreneur. Consolidated Agricultural Services had faced federal prosecution for the sabotage and intimidation campaign. Bill Sutherland was serving 18 months in federal prison, and the company had paid $12 million in fines, while agreeing to comprehensive environmental remediation of their operations upstream from the marsh. Dr. Mitchell's research had identified 17 species found nowhere else on Earth, while Dr. Vasquez's geological work had confirmed the site as one of the most significant impact craters in North America. The Blackwater Marsh had become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected for future generations while generating sustainable revenue. Through responsible resource management, Marcus pulled out his father's research journal and added a new entry. The marsh endures, the research continues. Some things are worth fighting for, especially when you don't have to fight alone. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Hoffman. New impact site discovered in Montana. Owner needs advice on protection strategies. Interested? Marcus smiled, looking out over the preserved wilderness that had cost him everything and given him more than he'd ever imagined possible. Marcus Chen's conservation legacy lived on, expanded now to protect geological treasures across the continent. The Marcus Chen's conservation legacy lived on, expanded now to protect geological treasures across the continent. Dinosaur killers had shaped Earth's history 66 million years ago. Now their legacy was shaping its future, one protected site at a time. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Marcus Chen's transformation from struggling property owner to environmental pioneer. This epic tale of family, science, and the courage to fight for what matters took us through nearly 50,000 words of adventure, discovery, and ultimate triumph. If this story captivated you as much as it did us, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with anyone who loves compelling storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest long-form narratives. We have more incredible stories coming that will take you on unforgettable journeys. What would you have done in Marcus's situation? Let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us create even better content for storytelling enthusiasts like yourself.